of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming back to the closing plenary of this virtual convening. I hope you've all felt that it's been an important and invigorating discussion. We certainly have as the conveners of the event. So I am Yasmin Ahmed, the Executive Director of Rights and Security International, and I'll be moderating this panel. And I will also be making some concluding remarks on behalf of the coalition of civil society organisations that are hosting this event. We will be taking questions, but because of the short time that we have, those questions will not be asked to the panellists, unfortunately, but they will be integrated into the final report that we do. So please do rest assured that your questions will be taken account of. In this closing session, we will hear about the way forward, how we can ensure that human rights, humanitarian considerations, and peace building are at the heart of counter-terrorism policies and practices. On this esteemed panel, we have Special Rapporteur for Nia Lane. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Ms. Ilse Brands-Keres, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and Head of the Office of Human Rights of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in New York. Mr. David Lewis, Executive Secretary of the Financial Action Task Force. And finally, Ambassador Olaf Skog, Head of the European Union Delegation to the United Nations. Welcome to all my esteemed panelists. The first question I'm going to go straight in now is to Assistant Secretary General Brandes-Keres, who will have to leave us a little early. So some of your questions will be up the front. The OHCHR has an important role in the UN counter-terrorism architecture, and especially around the protection of human rights in counter-terrorism efforts. Could you please talk to us through the role of the OHCHR in the UNCT architecture and how you engage with the system?
Well, thank you very much, and I will join with the others who have thanked you, the organizers, for convening this really important event, and I'm so happy to be able to be here. It also shows the importance and vibrancy of civil society in these days when we need it more than ever, of course. So the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy actually clearly mandates OHCHR to play a lead role in supporting states in countering terrorism while respecting human rights. And the strategy itself, of course, requires that human rights are the fundamental basis of all states and UN counterterrorism efforts. And in this, we are very happy to coordinate, of course, closely with the independent UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. So we make sure we're complementary in what we're doing. We are most visible, of course, and therefore presumably what the general public can see is when we speak up about documented violations of human rights in the fight against terrorism and the grave abuses also committed by terrorist groups. But a lot of our work is actually behind the scenes. So we work with both internal and external partners in integrating human rights in all counterterrorism activities of other UN entities, and also advocating for civil society involvement in counterterrorism debates, and also supporting member states in their work. So it spans, our counterterrorism work spans 4 areas. We do the monitoring and the reporting, technical support and capacity building, and then we also provide advice on policies, and in general, then the 4th area, the integration of human rights across all of UN counterterrorism activities, making sure that that work is really done consistently. So we also have in the world, we have, of course, where we have our presences in the field at the regional level and country level. That's where we, and including also the human rights components in the UN peace operations, very importantly, we monitor very closely and we report on abuses and violations of both states and terrorist groups. So we do find that beyond the speaking out part of it, it's very important to engage constructively, because we want, of course, to be part of the solution as well. So here we have examples of where we are working, for instance, in the G5 Sahel countries, We support the joint force there to develop a compliance framework to ensure that there is a response, but also to prevent violations of human rights and humanitarian law by the joint forces. And we also aim to serve member states at the headquarters by providing technical advice and support generally on human rights, counterterrorism issues in the discussions at the General Assembly and the Security Council. So we hope that we aim for member states to see us as a resource also for those debates. We do find that we stress the part that human rights, of course, are important in themselves, but they're indispensable also as a tool, really, to assist member states to effectively countering terrorism. And this is really to make sure that any kinds of measures taken are and actually are seen to be also legitimate, and so that they don't just really increase the grievances that are on the ground. And we think that it also means that the response will that way be effective. It's the only way for the response actually to be effective. Finally, we do leadership also on policy issues within the UN on this area. We have done research. We have a forthcoming research coming on human rights aspects of the use of artificial intelligence in counterterrorism. And we had also published guidance on human rights compliant responses to the threat posed by foreign fighters. So we make sure that we also work that all of the other entities take on board the human rights into their analyses and activities in this regard. We are particularly concerned, have been focusing, for instance, on issues of repatriations of foreign nationals from the camps in northeastern Syria. And also we have a role in chairing the Global Compact Working Group on Human Rights, Rule of Law, and victims of terrorism. So my last point, throughout all of this, of course, very importantly, we work very hard to make sure that civil society is included, and particularly also a focus on local civil society. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I think it's wonderful and very important for us to all hear the work that your office is doing, particularly in relation to strengthening and contributing to the fourth pillar and integrating it through the work of all of the United Nations are doing. I'll now move on to Ambassador Skog and ask you the next question. In your recent statement to the UN General Assembly, you said that counterterrorism efforts must be framed in a human rights compliant approach. We obviously, as civil society, completely agree. Could you please give us one or two maybe examples where this would make a real difference?
Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored. And I'm glad to hear that people pay attention to what we say in the General Assembly and the Security Council. That's good, because there's a lot of preparation that goes into those statements. So that's great. Look, just coming into this meeting, I was reading a statement that the Secretary General is just making in another meeting that is going on in this virtual world right now. And it was about the digital roadmap that the UN is currently launching under his leadership. And I just found a quote there, which I think is very important for the debate we're having here today. And he says this: the pandemic, and now he talks about the COVID, of course, the pandemic has ushered in some of the most intrusive surveillance technologies we have ever seen. Now and then he goes on to speak about the need, therefore, to have a human rights approach also as we deal with the pandemic. And I think the same is absolutely true when we talk about counterterrorism, not just because that human rights should come in as an afterthought or as something on the side for us to feel better about things, but it's actually we are convinced that violations of human rights in fighting, be it the pandemic or be it the counter, terrorism or extreme violence or extremism, it's counterproductive. It actually feeds radicalization rather than counter it in a productive way. So that's sort of the starting point we have. Now, so we are going to insist on this whenever we speak about counterterrorism. This is such an important part for us. So and being more concrete about this, in spite of the pillar structure of the global counterterrorism strategy, human rights cannot be separated from approaches and measures attributed to the three pillars, that, preventing, combating, and capacity building. So we must make sure that it's there, present in every part of the policy. Just to give some examples, now as we prepare for the review of the strategy, one of our ideas is to work on how recommendations from other parts of the UN system, for instance, in the Geneva, the whole human rights structure in the Office and the High Commission of Human Rights, how that can be integrated into counterterrorism and prevention of violent extremism programming. We've been considering that if the conclusions from the Universal Periodic Reviews, the UPRs, were to become a systematic part of the programming process, this could help frame the projects that we are, or the UN is conducting, planning, design, and implementing into a more human rights focused foundation. Secondly, we're working on updating guidance for best practice in monitoring and evaluation of some of this preventive work. This would allow us to better follow the human rights compliance and approach in programming again, and of course also feed lessons learned into future programming. So we have already a dialogue going with the UN OCT on monitoring and evaluation, and we will continue to share the best practices that we pick up also in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting and wonderful to hear two things that are incredibly concrete about how the UN and the member states are going to move forward with respect to this. I now move to our Special Rapporteur, Neelaine. The question I have for you is, do these negative efforts comport with what you've observed as the Special Rapporteur? And if so, let me ask you something very bluntly, and I apologise if it's too blunt. Is the system broken? And if so, how do we actually start fixing it?
So thanks to all the participants, and also thanks to the NGOs and civil society, such a wide and diverse and deep group of NGOs who've come together for this conversation. I think testament to the scale of interest in the NGO sector. And I think that was also represented in the inputs to the global counterterrorism strategy by, I think, far more NGOs than states, in fact, submitted their views. So it gives us a sense of what, of NGOs wanting to be part of this discussion, fully active and engaged. So what has the mandate observed? I think my mandate and my predecessors have both documented the both negative legal effects, but also the structural distortions that we're seeing within the UN from the rapid growth of a counterterrorism architecture, where human rights, to be blunt, is actually often quite marginal. I've often described it as the decorative fringe on the edge of the table, rather than sitting squarely at the table as a meaningful partner in every piece. And I think one of the reasons why that meaningful partnership is so important is because effective counterterrorism demands it. We do not address the threats we need to the demand. We don't create the kind of healthy, open, democratic societies we need if we're not including civil society and human rights into the core of the work that's being done in the counterterrorism space. So it's not just ineffective, it's also it's bad for the health of our societies to produce the kind of societies that we need. And let me say a couple of more things. One of the biggest concerns that I have documented, particularly in my Human Rights Council report last year, is the use of counterterrorism measures against civil society itself. The mandate has documented that between 2005 and 2018, almost 60% of the communications to the mandate involve the use of CT measures against civil society activists and human rights defenders. That's just not effective counterterrorism, nor does it get us to where we want in terms of decent, open, rights-bearing societies. So we have to start and understand that those are not just oddities in the systems. In some sense, they appear to be hardwired. And I am very much in agreement with the ambassador about how do we structurally address those deficits. So one way we structurally address those deficits is to give the role that the Undersecretary General has spoken to, the Assistant Secretary General has spoken to human rights and to OHCHR, to strengthen the role of OHCHR in this space in meaningful, practical and concrete ways, which includes paying for human rights in the global counterterrorism space, ensuring that both the bodies and the architecture are adequately supported. The second thing I think we have to do is ensure that the negative effects of counterterrorism are addressed upfront in capacity building and technical assistance. They can't be an afterthought. They have to be hardwired into the creation and construction of that work. The third thing I think we have to do is protect the legitimacy of the UN system itself from the bloating or overeating up of securitization within the UN system. Security doesn't solve every problem. Security is an important piece and partner in some of these problems, but we can't have every space in the UN, whether it's health, education, youth, being dominated by security-led mechanisms. That doesn't do the work we need those sectors to do, and in fact, it may prevent them from doing their work well. And finally, I think we have to make civil society a meaningful partner. One of the reasons I believe this convening has taken place is because civil society feels marginalized in the process. They've had to create their own space in order to be heard. And it is extraordinary that we've had so many states today join this conversation, including ambassadors coming in to be part of it. And I think those states are showing the kind of leadership for civil society and human rights that's so badly needed and needs to be heard also in the architecture. And some states, I think of states like Mexico, for example, that have supported the mandate that I hold over many years, have been active voices for this kind of change and this commitment to centralizing human rights. And I think what's really positive about this gathering is that they have active partners in civil society, thoughtful, active partners from across the globe who want to be part of that conversation and who are committed both to strengthening the institution of the UN, but also making sure that human rights is not a marginal piece of the counterterrorism conversation. It has to be central and a foundational building block of that conversation.
Thank you, Fionnuala. Thank you very much. I think that's incredibly important and eloquent points that really reflect what we as civil society feel very much as well. I'm going to now move back to Assistant Secretary Brands-Kellis because I know you have to leave early. So I have another question for you. What are the opportunities you see to strengthen human rights protections in the area of counterterrorism? And what is your advice on strengthening inclusion of civil society and human rights through all of the pillars of the UN? How do we do this?
Well, thank you. A little challenge for a couple of minutes, right? But I'm so glad that we are here to addressing those together. We do, and also that we on the panel seem very much to agree in the direction we're going. It really is the concern over the fourth pillar of the global counterterrorism strategy, and that is neglected, and the importance to really strengthen human rights in the whole infrastructure. But also really the issue of political, obviously, again, we come down to the political will, because one thing is, of course, where we have the statements that are being made, where that very often there is a reminder that is put into the language of resolutions and so on, but where it doesn't really lead to this change, because the political support that needs to be there to make sure that the infrastructure is put in place and that the resources are put in place, of course, doesn't always follow. So this clearly is something that needs a lot of attention. We also do see, of course, the restrictions, again, the misuse of terrorism at the national level, that is, if anything, even increasing in our concern these days, as we all know, following the events, and the whole marginalization, putting aside something where we, again, we already heard, and I fully agree also on the issue of the securitization that we need to address, that it's not really, on the contrary, that human rights really should be at the center and not the argument that all of the different working fields we have become securitized. So there is a clear role for member states to really to step up in this support for the fourth pillar. And obviously in the review of the global counterterrorism strategy that is postponed, this is something that we would be certainly welcoming very strongly, that is really made consistently in a way that is meaningful to have this. For us, there's also an issue of making sure that there's a reference to the different UN human rights mechanisms. Of course, the treaty bodies, special procedures, very clearly, also the UPR, and actually the recommendations that we have from the OHCHR field presences that I referred to earlier. And if that can be brought into specifically, explicitly with references in the documents that come up. So that clearly is something we are looking forward to. In terms of the civil society, for us, it is absolutely essential. I think we all agree, since we all are part of this event as well. But I think we can't stop saying it, that we simply cannot do this work without civil society. We are such close partners. And there's an issue of, even though, and there is a commitment, I think, across the board at the UN, and we have it also certainly from OHCHR, to make sure that civil society is empowered and fully, meaningfully participating. But I think that is reflected across the UN as we see the priorities also of the Secretary General, the recent call to action that really did emphasize the need to empower civil society and also to protect civic space as a top priority. And I think we need to work on that to make sure that the reminder is there, that again is not just words, it actually has meaning. And how do we translate that into action? It's the obvious point, of course, of civil society being there as the voices that hear and know the effect on the communities, especially communities that suffer the most from terrorism and from counterterrorism measures. I fully agree that really should be the focus as well, to make sure that we hear those voices, that we can adjust our policies accordingly, because it's the only way we can effectively, of course, also make sure that the policies work and are not counterproductive and don't lead to even more grievances or harm and suffering. And there are many roles there that we have for civil society. We need to make sure that we create the fora consistently for civil society to come in, also where maybe the stronger and more developed networks of civil society organizations make sure that those local ones that are connected to the communities are brought into, so that we hear that voice and are able to adjust our policies as a result of it. A great example, of course, also, and the whole issue that was already brought up in making sure that that there is not a misuse against civil society that work on counterterrorism, is also, of course, David Lewis, who's here on the panel, who also working on the financial action task force work, that making sure that kind of financing that is not there, that doesn't hinder the very important work that civil society is doing in countering terrorism, but misleading those kinds of events. Efforts, and also we have another. I mean, there are many examples where we make sure that we bring in civil society, remembering also that civil society is broader than simply established NGOs, that we are talking about groupings, also groupings of civil society or academics or religious leaders, for instance, where we had a good example where we're working in Tunisia, for instance, in making sure that there's good collaborative efforts in making sure that places of worship are free from violent extremism, discrimination, addressing the whole hate speech issues and so on. But I think in all of these different strains of work, it's very important for us to just recognize that we cannot do this work without civil society. So the partnership is absolutely essential. Thank you.
I thank you so much, and thank you for your participation on this panel. And I understand that you have to leave now, but we are very grateful for your words and your participation.
Thank you very much. I look forward to continuing our collaboration. Thanks a lot.
As do we. Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn the question over to Mr. Lewis. Around 4 years ago, FATF, Financial Action Task Force, reformed its recommendations on the regulation of the not-for-profit sector. That reform made explicit the requirement of states countering financing of terrorism measures do not disrupt legitimate civil society activities. And we as civil society felt that immensely. There are strong protections, even though the FATF's remit is about CTF and anti-money laundering policy. Can you talk to us through the thinking and the process that got you to this place?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm so pleased you're having this conversation. And I'm glad to follow on the remarks from the Assistant Secretary General, particularly around political buy-in. It's not enough to make statements and to put in place these rules. You have to make sure they're properly resourced to be implemented effectively on the ground. And I think regardless of whatever you're talking about, we suffer from that across the board. Over its 30-year history, the FATF has promoted anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing measures that we believe should complement and help to protect human rights. We don't only set these standards, but we assess the implementation of them through peer reviews involving more than 200 countries and supported by the UN, IMF, World Bank, OECD, and others. Effective implementation of the standards helps to prevent, detect, and disrupt criminal activity of all sorts, including kleptocrats and those seeking to abuse human rights. However, this doesn't mean and doesn't require draconian measures to achieve it. The FATF is committed to promoting proportionate and measured responses to achieve the ultimate aim of freeing communities from crime and terrorism. These measures implemented by countries need to be flexible enough to respond to the situation on the ground, and that's what we call a risk-based approach. When applied properly, it supports human rights. But when it isn't applied properly, it causes problems, and we do see that. In recent years, the FATF has worked more closely than ever with civil society in developing a risk-based approach, in particular to counter-terrorist financing requirements, and those around abuse of the non-profit sector. It's because we recognize the vital importance of NPOs in providing charitable services around the world, as well as the difficulty of providing assistance to those in need, often in remote regions. However, terrorists and terrorist organizations do abuse some legitimate NPOs, often without their knowledge, without the knowledge of their donors, their management or staff, and they may create sham charities to funnel money to terrorists. Today, the FATF is committed to actively engaging with the NPO community in an open and transparent manner in order to ensure that their practical knowledge and experience can be properly reflected in our standards. And this engagement has been critical to ensure that our standards do not cut across other important policy objectives, especially on international development and humanitarian assistance. This close work with NPOs helped us demonstrate that most non-profit organizations carry little or no terrorist financing risk. And we were able to make, as you say, very important changes to our standards in 2016 to effectively say that it's not acceptable for governments to over-regulate the sector in the name of counter-terrorism financing. Instead, countries should adopt effective and proportionate measures which should be commensurate to the terrorist financing risks that they identify through a risk-based approach. In the COVID-19 context, this is particularly crucial. We've heard from NPOs that this crisis is exacerbating existing difficulties for payments and disbursements of aid in particular. Early on, the FATF president issued a statement highlighting the important work NPOs are doing during this time, and he asked governments and banks to ensure that legitimate NPO activity is not being unnecessarily delayed, disrupted, or discouraged in any way. We've also encouraged governments and banks to work with the NPO community to ensure that much needed aid is getting to where it's needed. Financial inclusion has always been important for us. We realize that if we create rules that are too harsh, financial activity is driven underground, and that results in people resorting to cash, unregulated channels, and has unintended impact of limiting transparency and increasing the risk of the crimes occurring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly enlightening. Very much appreciated. I'm going to go back now to Special Rapporteur Nia Lane, and I'm going to ask you about what are the hurdles we face or will face in ensuring civil society participation, and how do we overcome them?
Thank you, Yasmin. So I think there are hurdles that are both, there are a couple of levels of hurdles. One is institutional. So within the UN system itself, there are barriers in the counterterrorism space to the sort of presence of civil society organizations in a meaningful, consistent, and sustained way. I think we should note positively that there have been some developments. So for example, UNCTED has established a regular briefing session that's now established and well put in place, which demonstrates the real, practical translation of a commitment to meeting civil society into a meeting structure. I think we have just seen the publication of a civil society strategy by the Office of Counter-Terrorism. I think much work still needs to be done. The strategy has to be implemented. And I think one of the key pieces of the strategy that the mandate would encourage further thinking on is not merely to see civil society as a means to an end, to commodify civil society, but rather to see civil society as an active partner. And I think there's still some work to be done in that regard, as well as a sustained, structured, visible, and consistent integration of civil society. I do want to say that one of the big challenges is that New York is not a friendly space for civil society actors to engage in the CT space. Unlike Geneva, where NGOs are kind of falling over each other, in the place where conversations around security are central, civil society doesn't have an obvious home or an obvious structured way to engage. And we've certainly seen that, for example, at the last high-level conference, and I hope that the next one we finally get to a second high-level conference, that there's an actual place for civil society to show up to. So some of these barriers are structural. They're built into not having space, not having consistency, and also not having the resources to come to New York. It's expensive, it's challenging. We have to think about how we enable, as the Assistant Secretary General said, not just the big NGOs to show up, but the small, grassroots, diverse NGOs. I do want to say that FATF is a model in some sense in this regard. I think it's a demonstration of what can be done when an entity which has a mandate actually uses it creatively to engage with civil society. And I think FATF has showed how that can be done. There will still be, as David knows, there's ongoing debate, and my mandate has had an ongoing and really productive engagement with FATF about how to push the envelope in that regard. But there are we shouldn't, I think, just focus on the UN. There are other entities out there doing a lot of CT work. I think of the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, which is an entirely closed space. We think of the Shanghai framework. There are lots of places regionally and globally where counterterrorism work is being done, security work is being done, and civil society is not part of that conversation. So the barriers are both structural, they're geographical, and bear in mind that in many countries, the definition of terrorism is so vague, so broad, so wide, that it captures the work of many civil society organizations. So we're seeing a significant degree of criminalization, harassment, exclusion, and targeting of civil society. So to get to the point of engagement, you have to be physically capable of functioning in the society in which you operate. So below the global level, we also have these multiple barriers at the national level that start with the definition of terrorism. And with that, I think it requires that kind of both macro and micro level approach to assure us that we're not just sort of taking a small slice and opening it up to civil society, but seeing the holistic security space and understanding that civil society is something to contribute in all of those nodal points.
Thank you so much. And I want to pick up on that actually and take us back to Ambassador Skoog. And I want to ask you, you've spoken publicly and all those on the panel have concurred with the need for civil society to be part of this process and to be engaged, not at the periphery, not in the implementation, but at the heart of the policy making. So we're knocking at the door, but we want to know where the key is. and how best do we as civil society engage with this? As Fanul, as the Special Rapporteur has said, whilst there is engagement in a lot of spaces in terms of the UN and other entities, it has been quite a blocked space in terms of CT for the civil society to engage with. So give us some recommendations of how we do this and how we do it effectively.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. And I think, you know, the door, if you want to knock our door, it's always open. But unfortunately, the EU, I mean, we're big and strong, and many countries align with us, etc. But we're not the only player in the UN, and it's sometimes you will hear this argument that, don't forget, you know, they will tell us that the UN is an organization made out of government representatives and governments. I mean, you know, at that point we usually you know, remind those countries of the UN Charter, which is very clear about the fact that the UN is there for the betterment of people. And of course, we come from a democratic tradition in the European Union side. As a matter of fact, we have strong democratic credentials to even to become a member of the European Union. And so for us, it's much more, shall we say, natural to understand that the whole credibility, the whole legitimacy of everything we do can only be there if it's done in consultation with the civil society. And so, but it is a bit of an uphill battle, and unfortunately, I think the trend that also the Special Rapporteur referred to, that, you know, in many parts of the world we see actually a shrinking space for civil society, and in this respect, New York and the UN is unfortunately a bit of a reflection of that, and I think we need to be even more vocal about this, and we are, not just in the counter-terrorism sphere, but across the board. You know, we have some important meetings and sessions coming up on the UN at 75, etc. And you will hear constantly the European Union insisting on the space for, you know, a credible space for the civil society. And I organize on a regular basis meetings with civil society. I think a good advice, because, you know, when we say, look, there's a consultation process, a negotiation going on about something, and we say you need to open up to civil society, and it's like, yeah, but, you know, it's space and time and etc. So the more we can just show that the voices of civil society are heard through umbrella organizations, through a consultation process that you are doing beforehand, so there's some very concise, concrete measures coming through. I think that's usually the best way of getting that bandwidth recognition. And we are, but on the counter-terrorism side, we're doing some quite concrete stuff also in the EU. We have the Civil Society Empowerment Program. There is an acronym for that, of course, CSEP, which is an umbrella initiative under the umbrella of the EU Internet Forum, which is supposed to tackle terrorist content online. And under that framework, civil society partners are really essential in countering and undermining and providing, shall we say, you know, alternative narratives on the internet. We also have the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN, which is a network of frontline or grassroots practitioners and first-liners, including NGOs and academia. This network provides the basis for exchanges of ideas, knowledge, and experiences, and its outputs feed directly into our policy making. And that deals with violent extremism and radicalization and how to, you know, politically deal with that. I think the Special Rapporteur referred also to this civil society engagement strategy that the OCT is taking up recently. We see that as a positive first step, but we also understand that it's very much, it shouldn't be just about civil society knocking on our door. We need to also make sure that that door is open and is being opened, and it's also then that the conversation is meaningful. You know, so we speak. Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit our instrument in the UN. It's just a lot of statements, but there is more than that. You know, we have a few conferences coming up, not necessarily in the counter-terrorism sphere, but where we see some countries are blocking participation of NGOs. And sometimes they can do that, you know, for free. It's costless. So we are confronting them and insisting that there are arguments and reasoning why this particular NGO is not, allowed. So at least we're raising the bar a little bit in terms of, making it more difficult for countries that want to block participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we as civil society look forward to discussing with the EU and discussing with member states and the CT apparatus of the UN, which is obviously made up of member states, of how we can take that forward and create more inclusive spaces. Obviously, we have things like the RAN network, but there are even within those spaces exclusion from certain types of civil society. So I think it's an ongoing and important discussion that we will continue. And I appreciate your commitment and your commitment that you have shown as well, and that you will continue to show. Okay, I'm now going to be quite strict with time because we don't have that much left, and I do want to hear from everyone, ask all the questions. My next question now is to Mr. Lewis. In 2016, you said, the not-for-profit organisation engagement with FATF is organised, informed and constructive, and a great model for other sectors to follow. Do you think that other CT institutions can build such a positive relationship with civil society? And what lessons can you share with an international body to do this?
Thank you. Yes, I do, in short. We've come a long way. It's been a joint effort with our civil society colleagues in order to create a real partnership. Initially, there was suspicion and antagonism, but we've worked hard on the relationship now over a number of years. We also have a good relationship through the UN, such as through Fiona, and we share information to inform our respective work and evaluations, and that's really important. I guess several things were important to build the relationship with civil society. Firstly, identifying the key interlocutors at the right level. So we're an inclusive, member-driven organisation like the UN, and members really prioritise these issues and ensured that high-level support was there for this engagement from the start. We dedicated someone at my team in the Secretariat at a high level to prioritise and manage this engagement, and to provide a single point of contact for civil society. So they need to know who to go to. On the civil society side, there are a broad range of stakeholders, often with divergent views, and that's difficult for us. But the MPOs made it so easy by creating a coalition of interested and informed stakeholders that could engage with us. And I say interested and informed because they took the time to really understand our work. And I think that makes a huge difference. So our interlocutors on the civil society side were experienced enough to represent and convey other stakeholders in the community. And it really helps when civil society is organised, where they can collect evidence and demonstrate what's happening on the ground and provide consistent messages in terms of what they want from us. Secondly, time to build trust and understanding. Sometimes it feels like we're speaking different languages. There were misunderstandings at the beginning about our mandate and our standards. We were clear about what we could do and what was outside of our mandate. And it took time to educate parties on all sides and understand better our common objectives, including ultimately saving and improving lives and preventing terrorists and criminals from abusing charities to support their activity. Personal relationships and consistency of those individuals involved in the process has been key, and to make sure that we don't have to completely recreate those relationships every few months. Finally, transparency and inclusive and structured engagement at every level. So at country level, our engagement is part of every evaluation. Our procedures require this. We let NPOs know how to engage with us. We have information on our website. We tell people when our evaluations are coming up. And we combine that with an ongoing dialogue between my team and those organizations. So as and when they find information that might be useful to us before our evaluations, we can take that into account. So the relationship's been critical to the FATF and has been appreciated by our stakeholders. We've made changes to the standards to support MPOs, and we're using our evaluations and guidance to better promote implementation on the ground. My team has recently also developed training and support capacity, which is focused on non-member countries. That gets out of the sort of the FATF core membership and reaches developing countries. And I think that's really important because often they're neglected. And the FATF now, through that global network, is committed to ensuring that engagement continues. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's incredibly important and reassuring to hear about the meaningful, integrated, transparent, and sustained engagement with civil society. It's not a superficial and marginalised engagement, and that's one that we certainly would like to see reflected in the counter-terrorism architecture and in all the elements of the UN. So thank you very much. It's a very good example for us. Okay, I'm now going to move back to Special Rapporteur Neil and ask you, we have already seen that the UN bodies are looking at COVID-19 through the lens of securitization. For example, on the CTED upcoming agenda is the item examining what they call the complementarities between the response to and recovery from COVID-19 and the counter-terrorism agenda. What's your take on this? What kind of complementarities are UN bodies going to look at?
Yeah, so I think, of course, we're all sitting at our computers, testament to the grave impact on human rights, the most fundamental of rights that the pandemic has imposed upon us. It affects maybe the primary right, the right to life, the right from which all other rights follow. And if anyone ever thought that the right to health was not a right, I think the global pandemic has reminded us of the essential quality and the indivisibility of rights in a way that is profound and really important. But I will say, and the mandate came out with 24 other special rapporteurs in mid-March to acknowledge our concern about the securitization of the COVID space. We recognize under international law, under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states have the right to limit rights in times of exception. And a health emergency can be a time of exception where a state can take legitimate, proportionate, and necessary measures to respond to a health crisis. We saw that in the H1N1 crisis. And so there are precedents for states using exceptional and security powers in this context. But that's not a blank check. And our concern right now is that many states, I've described it in other fora as a layered cake. We see a layered cake of security responses to COVID. They include formal emergency powers in contexts where it's unclear that all of those powers are necessary to fight a health crisis, but are really being used to advance a set of securitized interests, crisis being opportunity for some states to concentrate power, to empower security sectors, to engage in mass surveillance of their populations. That is deeply concerning to the health of our global democracies, accountabilities, and transparencies. The second thing we're seeing is de facto emergencies, no formal statement, but the use of exceptional powers in ways that deepen, again, lack of accountability, lack of transparency, and are ripe with human rights abuses. And the third layer is an acceleration of executive powers across the globe. Again, one of the things those of us who spend our lives working on exceptionality know is that when power is taken, it's very difficult to give it back. When exception becomes norm, it's very difficult to get back to normal. So again, we're seeing an extraordinary explosion of, I think, executive powers. And the mandate with two NGOs who are also involved in organizing this event, ECNL and ICNL, have established a global tracker on those emergency powers and the use of these kinds of exceptionalities. All to say that it worries me deeply when the counterterrorism structure says it has a response to COVID, because we were already facing a deficit of confidence in human rights, in accountability on the CT side, particularly because, as I've said before, so many states have definitions of terrorism that do not comport to the singular definition we find in UN Security Resolution 1566 and in the suppression treaties. And so what that means is that what can be done in this space is extraordinarily detrimental, and security is a necessary but not sufficient means to respond to the nature of the crisis we're facing in COVID. And the danger is that we will wake up the morning after COVID, if there is such a morning, and find that we may be free of the virus or have a vaccine for the virus, but what we don't have is a vaccine against the kind of creepage of exceptionality that has spread across the globe, that has closed down and shut down the openness and transparency that's necessary to living dignified lives. And so I think I would just profoundly caution against the conflation that we're starting to see, caution against the rush to exceptionality, and also caution against the kind of embrace of public-private partnerships in the security space around COVID that are under-regulated, non-transparent, and lack a basis, not just in human rights, but in law more generally. And so with all of those strong, profound caveats, I think we have to be very careful in this space, and states have to be careful about what's happening in this CT space in response to COVID.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur Elaine. It's certainly something that all of the organisations who are convening this event have been very concerned about, and obviously it's something that reflected by yourselves and a number of special rapporteurs as well. So thank you for those insightful comments. I will now move on for our final question, and I'm moving back to Ambassador Skoog for something quite concrete. And I think you have already, and I think you have throughout the answers that you've given us on this panel, you have been incredibly concrete, for which we're very grateful. But we want to ask you specifically, what will the EU do to support some of the calls for a more inclusive UNCT system? And most importantly, for better respect for human rights in the context of counterterrorism. Perhaps give us 1 to 2 concrete action points and commitments.
Sorry, something happened. Do you hear me? You can hear me. No. I can't, sorry. Should I speak?
Yes, did you hear?
Oh yeah, now I hear you. All
sorry.
Right. I didn't try to sneak away from answering.
Sorry, I think it might have been me, not you. I think I don't know if I was saying some great question and you weren't able to hear it.
No, I think I know the question. I mean, you're asking me to be very concrete about some commitments, and I'll be happy to
absolutely
do that, and I'll be brief. I think there are 3 things that we can commit to, having listened to this debate. One is, to continue to be very, very strong in everything we say in Security Council, in General Assembly resolutions, and whatever, that the counter-terrorism strategies of the UN needs to be inclusive and fully respect human rights. Secondly, when it comes to, when we prepare internally our positions for the review, etc., that we will be extremely inclusive in terms of listening to civil society, and that's a very clear commitment. Thirdly, when it comes to the, I mean, in only a few weeks, there is this pandemic. It's the Counter-Terrorism Virtual Week, which will focus on some of the things that the Special Rapporteur just mentioned. And I just want to say that we will absolutely commit to making EU priorities that there is a human rights-based approach, and that civil society is involved. And I am horrified by, and I think the Special Rapporteur made such an eloquent explanation of the risks of the securitization of the COVID-19 response. So that is something that we absolutely must be avoided at all costs, and that will be part of our input during the upcoming conferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to now, and I'm probably 1 minute maximum, I'm going to invite Mr. Lewis to provide some final reflections on what you have heard and what the way forward may be.
Thank you. And I think I can probably be shorter than that. So for us, civil societies at the front line, playing a critical role, and therefore their experience and their knowledge is essential in informing effective counter-terrorism action across the board. So for the FATF, it's become vital to maintain an open and transparent dialogue with civil society, not only when doing our evaluations and when implementing things on the ground, but when developing policy. So bringing them in right up front, having those discussions when we develop our standards, and then having them engaged on an ongoing basis. All of that, though, takes a lot of effort, and it's a big investment. But all I can say is that I think it was probably more effort beforehand. We just didn't measure it. We weren't aware of it because we were constantly reacting kind of negatively to it. But having them in the tent and working with them makes a real difference. So again, I can only thank you for organising this today and giving us the chance to participate.
Well, thank you so much to all of the esteemed panelists on behalf of all of the organisations that have organised this convening today. We are very much appreciative. And I'm going to now move to saying our sort of final remarks and concluding remarks. So thank you very much to the panelists, and now I will move to doing that. So, as I said, I would like to thank not only all of the people who have been moderators and panelists, but all of you, all hundreds of you who have participated in this event. And please rest assured that the questions that you have submitted for this final plenary will be taken account of. We've been reviewing all the questions as this has been happening, and there's some fantastic questions that have come up, and I think only highlights the importance and the need for this discussion to keep going. But we want you to know, as those who are participating in this event, that your voices are heard and that your perspectives will be integrated into how we move forward. So first of all, I would also like to make a particular thanks to the EU delegation to the UN, the permanent missions of Spain and Tunisia, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Executive Secretary of the Financial Action Task Force, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. To effectively reform this system, we need to do so hand in hand with member states, regional bodies, and the United Nations institutions that work on counterterrorism and human rights. I would also like to sincerely thank all the hundreds of CSO organisations, civil society organisations, who have joined from all around the world, hundreds and hundreds of you, and who have participated in this event. This event is about you and for you, and the victims of the excessive and misplaced counterterrorism measures, those that have unjustifiably deprived persons of life, liberty, security, and dignity in the name of counterterrorism, have inflicted untold damage in terms of closing democratic and civic space. We also acknowledge the victims of terrorism, and that measures in the context of CT need to consider both the victims of terrorism and the victims of counterterrorism measures. We acknowledge the societies that have been disrupted and destabilised as a result of counterterrorism agenda, and that have not had the privilege of peace, security, humanitarian protection. In conclusion, I would say, from hearing everything that we have heard today, from the incredibly important discussion that we've had, that is clear from all that has been said, that we need a system. We need a system that is centred on people, peace building, humanitarianism, and a common respect for the promotion of human rights. We've identified, and I think it's pretty clear from the discussions, 4 important recommendations and 4 important trends that we've seen coming out. The first is that, especially since the catastrophe of 9/11, counterterrorism responses have been over-securitized and militarized, and they have not delivered genuine safety and security for most people and communities. That there is a significant danger in what we are seeing today, and has been raised so eloquently by the Special Rapporteur, Neil Lane, that the exponential growth of UN counterterrorism bodies and mechanisms without adequate and equal attention to the pillars of the UN system concerned with human rights, peace building, and humanitarian protection is in fact a threat to us all. Thirdly, that counterterrorism measures, both as a matter of law and policy, must not only respect human rights, but should also promote them. UN counterterrorism measures will only be fit for purpose if and when civil society is given a greater voice in their design, not just in their implementation. Fifth, and I'm doing a few more than I said I would, that's because we've added as the session has gone on, there are significant dangers in applying a security-minded approach to the international response to COVID-19. There is a moment now that, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and other things we have seen, to really reflect on further criminalization and further securitization, and whether in fact that is the response to the threats that we all collectively face, and whether they are the effective responses. And finally, that states and the UN must ensure that measures designed to protect and assist victims of terrorism, which is incredibly important, respect human rights and are not only used as a pretext to undermine human rights. So finally, we as human rights, peacebuilding and humanitarian organisation stand ready to walk hand in hand with the UN and member states to construct an inclusive system and to collectively respond to terrorism and other challenges that we face as a global community. We're living in an unprecedented times, as we all note today, in light of COVID-19 and the extraordinary things that we are seeing each and every day in relation to Black Lives Matters and racism and all those issues. These can only be overcome if civil society, those people who are impacted and affected by the measures that the United Nations and that member states are implementing, are at the center, not the periphery, of the response to our security. So I again would like to thank you, and I'll leave you with those messages today, but we will not be leaving here without a further plan going forward. Like any good organization of states, of organizations or others, we have plans and we would like to see those plans implemented. So what are we going to do going forward? There will be many things, and we will certainly take up all of the suggestions and all of the comments that have been made by the states and the UN in terms of, and UN representatives, in terms of how you will look to ensure that we are not only invited to the table and thankful for the invitation, but we are at the heart of what you are doing. And really, that is the challenge for you, because it's not enough to have us at the table. We have to be seen as genuine partners in this endeavour. So in July, we intend to hold another event to ensure that this conversation continues through and beyond UNCT Week. And we hope that in the context of UNCT Week, those that are hosting it will reflect on the conversations that we will have today, that we have had today. We look forward to hearing from Spain and other states, Spain in particular as the co-coordinator of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy Review, as to how we best collaborate and engage in the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy Review process. And we will be sending our own suggestions, and we look forward to engaging with member states on this. And many member states have been very positive in terms of their engagement with us, and we look forward to that engagement, that continued and sustained engagement. We also look forward to hearing from the Office for Counter-Terrorism about how we can bring our messages to the High-Level Week and be integrated in that. And finally, we encourage all of the CSO participants today. We are not speaking for you. You have voices to speak for yourselves, and we are proud to provide a forum for you. And we want to ensure that you are part of this collective moving forward. We will be preparing a report from this event. And if you would like yourselves, the CSOs, and anyone, the government's representatives, UN representatives, academics, students, and all who've participated, you can contact us on csoadvocacy@gmail.com, and we will provide you with a copy of that report. And we will also obviously be using social media to get that out there. But just to remind you, it's csoadvocacy@gmail.com. Finally, I would like to thank you all and say that we look very forward to taking this process forward. And we thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.